I was never really looking forward to Solo, a Star Wars story, but it actually ended up surprising me and being far worse than I ever expected. I mean, wow. Just wow. This is a prime example of how to do just everything wrong. But what really stuck out to me about this film was that it confirmed pretty much every fear I had about these Star Wars spin-offs. I was never very optimistic about these so-called Star Wars stories, mainly because I appreciate the simplicity of Star Wars, and having so many spin-offs happening, it just seemed like the franchise starting to balloon outwards to an unpleasant size. The two spin-offs that have been released so far, Rogue One and Solo, share a lot of similarities, and both make me very nervous about the future of this franchise. And it all begins with the stories that these spin-offs are choosing to tell. When you look at the original trilogy, it tells a very straightforward story. Nothing really needed to be expanded. Still, considering the Star Wars galaxy as a whole, the options were endless, and these spin-offs were the opportunity for some really interesting storytelling. Any genre could be drawn on, any character could be invented, and any small facet of the galaxy could be freely explored because the Star Wars brand would always draw people in. Instead, these films are just going back to the stories and characters that we've already seen and not branching out in any creative way. Whether it's the rebels stealing the Death Star plans, a young Han Solo, Boba Fett, or possibly Obi-Wan Kenobi, the ideas just seem so limited. From a producer's standpoint, I understand. It's much more marketable to bring back classic iconography and beloved characters instead of trying something wildly different. And to be fair, because Star Wars told such a simple story, there's nothing inherently wrong with going back and fleshing out some details, making things feel more complex. But either way, going back to the same material over and over again gets tiring, especially when nothing new is being done with it. The spin-offs are primarily trying to recapture the tone and aesthetic of the original trilogy, and while that is interesting to see again, the stories themselves aren't working. Mainly because they're prequels, and prequels are pretty much never good. Star Wars prequels especially don't exactly have the best reputation.
You're not all powerful.
Well, I should be. Someday I will be. I will be the most powerful Jedi ever. I promise you. I will even learn to stop people from dying.
A big part of what made the original trilogy feel special was that it was clearly taking place in the middle of a bigger story. We got allusions to things like the Clone Wars and the Jedi Knights, and characters had these vague, mysterious, intriguing backstories. The galaxy felt lived in, it felt tangible, it felt like we could never fully understand it, and we didn't need to. So all that prequels really do is take away from that sense of mystery and fill in blanks that don't need to be filled in. Also, the answers can never really live up to the questions and always end up being unsatisfactory. For example, Solo, a Star Wars story, reveals that Han met Chewbacca, got his blaster, met Lando, made the Kessel Run, learned to shoot first, won the Millennium Falcon, and set off to meet Jabba the Hutt in about a weekend's worth of time. I always assumed that stuff had happened over a lifetime of adventures, but no, he did it all in one shot. And all of those things play out in the most straightforward ways possible, making Solo itself feel pointless because the original trilogy had already given us that information. You gain no new insight, there's no twist or surprise, things just happen as we were told they happened. And when other things get explained and the explanation isn't obvious, it's even worse. In possibly the film's stupidest moment, it's revealed where Han Solo got his last name, and the big twist is that it's not actually his last name. It was given to him because he had no last name, and he was alone. He was Solo. But Solo serves as his last name for the rest of the series and carries no significance beyond that, so why? It really couldn't have just been his last name?
Those first encounters with Chewbacca.
You're gonna need a nickname, because I ain't saying that every time.
These decisions thankfully don't make the original films feel any different or any worse, but they do give me the impression that the people making these films don't really get Star Wars. They get the fans' perspective of Star Wars, but like with Rogue One, that's not the same thing. And at their core, these Star Wars stories exist only to eat away at what made the original films feel special, feel intriguing. Although, to be fair, Star Wars hasn't really been special in a long time, given the new direction the series is being pushed in. Speaking of which, you know what's great? The Marvel Cinematic Universe. What a massive achievement, connecting so many different characters and stories together into one cohesive whole through a decade of filmmaking. You know what's not great? When other franchises try to do that. Star Wars is clearly being transformed into a Marvel-esque style of storytelling, which makes sense because that would make Disney more money. But obviously, Star Wars and Marvel are rooted in two very different storytelling methods. I can't say for sure that the Marvel style will never work for Star Wars, but there's one scene in Solo that's just so unbelievably stupid, and the Marvel influence is so clear. Throughout the whole movie, this crime syndicate called Crimson Dawn is being hyped up, and at the end, we finally meet the group's leader, and it turns out to be Darth Maul. I'm sure this reveal confused more than a few people in the audience because Maul was previously chopped in half before falling down a pit. I haven't watched the Clone Wars or Rebels, but I am aware that Maul gets a lot of characterization and development, and I'm sure it's fine. But a lot of people aren't aware of that, and Solo still treats this reveal like it's a big twist for this specific story to have, when really it only makes sense for people who've either consumed every piece of canon Star Wars media in the past decade or have a passing knowledge of a cartoon they haven't seen. That really irritates me because it takes away from the sense of completeness in a single film. But much like Marvel, Star Wars is not trying to tell a bunch of single stories anymore. It's all telling one big story. The Darth Maul reveal is very cheap fan service, but it doesn't even service the plot. It just grinds the movie to a halt to say, hey, look at this recognizable thing, that'll be in some other movie sometime. I wonder where they got that idea from. I don't think Star Wars should be structured like Marvel because that's not where its strengths lie. Its strengths lie in the ongoing struggle of good against evil, themes of friendship, love, and legacy, spectacle, but with resonant emotion behind it. But the future of Star Wars looks to simply be treading the same ground over and over again, endlessly pandering because people like this thing or this character. And when I see how people react to these spin-offs saying these are the real Star Wars movies, I get a little frustrated. I mean, obviously you can like or dislike Star Wars for whatever reason you want. That's pretty much the most inconsequential decision a person can make. But it's very telling to me that so many people are content to simply be shown familiar images and characters and have their nostalgia exploited so blatantly. And when a Star Wars movie tries to challenge the ideas of what the franchise can do or should be, there's massive backlash. My main issue with the Star Wars stories is that they're lazy, and not in terms of actual filmmaking. That obviously takes a lot of work, especially when they keep firing directors. I mean laziness in storytelling, by just relying on nostalgia to carry a plot. The emotion that Star Wars brings can't be recaptured just by having a character named Han Solo. That feels disingenuous. And yet, that's all that fans seem to want. They don't want the series to change at all, which I think is ultimately harmful to how it's perceived. Because from Lucasfilm's perspective, why bother experimenting when the bare minimum is so successful? If risk and experimentation get such massive backlash, they're not going to do that again anytime soon. I want this franchise to evolve. I want to be surprised and not have every spin-off be tied so tightly to the original trilogy. Oh, wait, the next one's about Boba Fett. Maybe change is still coming, and maybe future Star Wars projects will really branch out and try new things. Rian Johnson's trilogy, or the series of films that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are making, those could be anything. But for now, the nostalgic shine that these spin-off films carried has worn off for me, and the stories they're telling feel so pointless and empty. When it comes to the Star Wars story brand specifically, the future looks very shaky. I don't know if these films will ever deliver something that lives up to the franchise at its best. Who knows? James Mangold is a very good director, and Boba Fett is the blankest slate, so he might make something very special. Or maybe he'll get fired. Both are equally likely. We'll just have to wait and see. But until then, Solo is absolute garbage, and I'm sure everyone is very, very excited to tell me how wrong I am, and how it was the best Star Wars movie, or it was the worst, or it was just okay. Unfortunately, the conversation around Star Wars is now just as predictable as the franchise itself, and I hope I can rediscover that magic sometime soon. At least I can be happy in the knowledge that they can never make a worse character than L3.